Hey, what's up guys? We are back and this is Shelby here with your second to last video of part 1 of CSS for BizStream Academy today. So you guys are holding it out here. I know this is a ton of information. You're doing great. If you have any questions, just another reminder that Chris and I are here on Discord if you need anything. So in our last video, we went over a few concepts of positioning selectors, specificity, and cascading CSS. We didn't really go over any new properties, but that doesn't mean that these concepts are not important to organize and really structure out your code. Before I move forward with some new properties I want to show you in this video, let's look at my CSS to see what I have done in terms of specificity, positioning selectors, and comma separated values. If you can remember in my last video, I went ahead and made this rule on line number 6 that condensed my styles for all of the headings in my HTML. This rule is stating I want every heading from H1 to H6 in this list to have this color applied to it as well as this font family. Whereas before, we had 6 different rules for each heading being applied, and it became very long and very hard to read in our CSS. So I made this example of comma separated selectors to show you how these styles can be reused across your site on different selectors. I also went ahead and if we come down here to line 40, I wrote a position selector rule. And this rule is a little bit different than the one I wrote before with my headings because there is no comma but rather just a space. So this is stating that I don't want every styled heading to necessarily be this color, but I only want the styled headings inside of the div with the ID of header to have this color. And in terms of specificity, this rule above on line 36 is stating that I want every styled heading to be the color red. But because this selector on line 40 is more specific than just stating the styled heading, this color is going to win for any element that has the class of styled heading inside of header. To show you that in my HTML, I have my div of header right here, and nested inside of it, this H1 has the class of styled heading. With this CSS rule, you would think the color would be red, but because I added this position selector in here, if we go to my site and refresh, you can see that my heading is that light white color that I added with that hexadecimal value. Even though this element has a class of styled heading, that doesn't mean I can't use that class elsewhere on my site. Say I wanted to add this class to my H2. And I put in styled heading there. You can see because this styled heading class is not nested inside of a div with the ID of header, the rule that only has that selector of styled heading in my CSS is what's being applied. So you can see this rule on 36 is what is being applied to that H2 with that class of styled heading, but because it's not in that div of header, it does not get this color as well. So these are just two concepts of specificity as well as position selectors by targeting elements inside of each other with your CSS selectors. All right, so let's get back into it and jump into a new property of display. So inline versus block in HTML CSS. Every HTML element has a default display type. For most, they will either be inline or block. A block element is an element that will take up the full width of any available space and will always stay on its own line. This means that any block elements that are next to each other are always going to break into a new line, kind of like a line break. Whereas an inline element will only take up as much space as the content it has, and it will never start on a new line. So you can nest inline elements inside of block elements, and it will not break into a new line like it would if you had two block elements next to each other. Here are a few examples of inline versus block elements. Some common block elements that we already have in our HTML are things like a div tag, or heading tags, or paragraph tags. Easy visible example of a block element are these 3 paragraphs here. In your HTML, this content is wrapped in a paragraph tag as well as this one. And even though you didn't go in and give it a line break here, your HTML already did it for you because these are what are considered block elements. Examples of inline elements are images, spans, and link tags. So an example in our site would be your links that you added, or our EM tags or our strong tags. When you went in and put a link inside of a paragraph tag, you would notice it looks a little different on your site because that link does not break into a new line, but rather it is in line with that paragraph text. So this is a good example of an inline element, which is this link, versus these block elements of this list next to this paragraph tag. This image may look like it's a block element, but that's only because it is a standalone image in your HTML right now. I'm going to go in and copy that image, and we can see what happens when I put that in line with that first image on your website. So now you can see I have my image here that starts on line 77, and then the next one that is on line 81. When I refresh, that second image doesn't break into a new line, but rather it is in line with that first image tag, and that is because images are inline elements. I'm going to go in and remove this image and just go back to my one GIF of Baby Yoda. But that was just one example of what inline elements do when they are next to each other rather than paragraph tags, which are block elements. Even though HTML elements have these display properties set by default, that doesn't mean that we can't change them. And that is with CSS. Using your styles, we can change the default value for the display of an HTML element. If we wanted the default display of an inline to change for an image tag, we would use this CSS listed below. By doing this, it would cause the image tag to sit on its own line and not be in line with that other image tag. I'm going to actually undo what I just did and put the other Baby Yoda back in there. Make sure they're still in line with each other. And I'm going to add this exact CSS rule to my styles. And again, remember this is an image tag selector, and this display property can be block or inline. Because an image's default display is inline, we're coming in with CSS and adding this value of block to this property of display, which will then put your image on a new line. So aside from block elements like images and headings and paragraph tags, a new inline element we're going to use is a span tag. A span tag is primarily used within headings or paragraphs to manipulate certain sections of text. In this example, we have a span with the class of highlight inside of a paragraph tag. And because it is an inline element, this means that all of this text will still read normal, but this text inside of the span will be able to be targeted with CSS. An example I'm going to show you is how to style some text differently inside of your H1 tag when using a span. In my index file of my HTML, I'm going to find my H1 tag, and I want this quote of Baby Yoda to look a little different than the H1 text in general. So we're going to add a span class, a span with the class of decorated. And remember, those values of a class can be anything you want them to be, as long as you make sure that the CSS rule in that class selector matches the value that you put in your HTML. So I don't really want to do much to this quote inside of my span, but I do want it to look a little bit different. So we are going to go in and add a new CSS rule. This selector is going to target any HTML element, so in this case a span with the class of decorated, and change the font family to Dancing Script. This is a font that I loaded from Google Fonts and put into my website. We talked about adding these fonts in a previous video. So now, when I refresh my page, you can see my heading is still all in one line, but that text that is inside of that span I created looks a little bit different because I targeted it with using that CSS class of decorated. Let's take a little bit of time here to start adding spans with classes on them into your HTML. Try to target some text inside of your headings or paragraphs and then style it with some CSS to get some emphasized text that's styled differently like I did for my heading. If you have any questions of inline versus block elements or are still a little bit stuck on what to do to change the display of elements on your page, be sure to reach out and let us know. See you soon.